All right. Good afternoon, I guess it is now. This is going to be the lecture over plant reproduction, the one that we will be covering on October the 9th. So when I see you, we will be covering this in person, but this is just kind of a quick prelude to what awaits you. So we will be kind of discussing the plant reproduction, and with that, the flowers are the reproductive organs of plants. Hopefully, we can find some to look at in lab tonight. If not, we may have to go out on a scavenger hunt on campus. I'm sure we can find some there, but we will take a look at some of them in person tonight so we can see some of them. But the flowers are those reproductive organs of them. Whenever we're looking at the flower structure, this is something that's kind of important to you. So just kind of take a look at this slide for a little bit, but we have the anther, the filament. We obviously have the petals that go along with that, and that's on the left side, which is the stamen. Then on the other side, and by the way, the stamen is the male part of the plant. The carpel is on the female side, which is the stigma, the style, and then the ovary and the ovule, which is inside there. And then we have the receptacle and the peduncle underneath, the sepal and the petals, which kind of the petals serve as a protective coating for all of this. So again, everything on the left side, the stamen with the anther and the filament would be the male reproductive parts. On the right side, what we would consider the female, which is the carpel, which is the stigma, the style, the ovary, and the ovule. So whenever we look at some of these, you can click here and kind of show all of them. We will talk about them individually in class, so you won't really have to go through that, but you could actually click on each of these, and it kind of goes through some of them. It doesn't work that well, so never mind. So whenever we talk about the sexual reproductive strategies of plants have two stages. They're alternating life cycles. The diploid sporophyte is the dominant and produces the haploid spores by meiosis. If you remember last time we talked about diploid means the full number or double, or two sets, if you will. The haploid is half of that diploid number. Meiosis is the process that is the two stages that it goes through. It is this portion of the life cycle that bears the flower. So it's through that process of meiosis that the plant actually bears flowers. Flowering produces two types of spores, either microspores or megaspores. Pretty obvious what those two mean. Microspores are very, very small. The megaspores are the larger ones. The spores actually divide through a process of mitosis to get the haploid gametophytes. So mitosis is that first stage, remember, of interphase, and then prophase, metaphase, anaphase, telophase through that afternoon. I guess talked about now how this is going to be plant cells. If you remember, plant reproduction, plant cells are going to get that cell plate and that cell wall on the gametes. The gametophytes would produce the gametes. So when I see you, we will be gametes fuse to produce. But this is just kind of a quick zygote. So zygote to what awaits you is then going to what. So we will be kind of discussing to become the diploid plant reproduction, and with that, the flowers are the reproductive organs. All this is through hopefully you can find some to look at in lab tonight. If not, so whenever we look at it, here is a good representation. I'm sure we can find some there. So if we start, we will take a look at some. We have the sporophyte. We have a full-fledged flower tonight, so we can see some of them. But the flowers we have the anther organs of them. Whenever we're looking at the flower structure, this is something that's kind of important to you. So just kind of take a look at this. So what we have is reproduction. But we have the anther, the filament. We obviously have the petals over into the ovary. And then we're going to get the meiosis to take place on the left side, which is the stamen. So as we get that meiosis to take place, and by the way, the stamen microspore is the male part coming from the anther, and we have a megaspore is coming on the female side, which is the stigma, the style. So if you want to think of them as the sperm, which is inside the egg, and then if that's easier for you to think about, but really what it is the pollen grain. The sepal is the microspore coming from the male side, protective coating, and the female gametophyte is the embryo sac, which is the megaspore coming from the other side. The filament, so would be the male. What happens then is they do become the sperm in the egg. Consider the female, and as they do so, they fertilize, and as they fertilize, they become a zygote. So whenever we look at some of these,
and that
You can click
zygote
here
then becomes
and
a
kind of
seed.
show
All
and
of
that
them.
seed
We will
goes
talk
through
about them
mitosis
individually in class,
and
so you
develops
won't
into
really
a
have
sporophyte.
to go through that. But
So
you
that's
could
kind of the
actually
process,
click on
kind of
each of
quick
these,
running
and it kinda
around
goes
there. So we have the
through
sporophyte,
some
we
of
have a
them, but
flower,
it doesn't work
and that
that way.
flower
So,
produces, goes through the meiosis
so
the
whenever we
meiosis
talk about the
process
sexual reproductive
first,
strategies of plants,
which is the
plants have
reproductive
two
process.
stages.
Then it goes
They're
through the
alternating
mitosis
life
process,
cycles.
which is the
Splitting
diploid
sporophyte
is the
to
dominant
produce.
and produces the
So it's a
haploid
little bit maybe
spores
different than what you
by
thought
meiosis.
before,
So
but
you
just
remember
kind of
last
pay
time we
attention
talked
to this
about
so that you know this
diploid
here
means
then
the full number or double.
we're going to kind of take two sets.
We have the
if you will.
seed here. The
Okay.
haploid
We're
is
going to go
half
through what
of
has to
that
happen for
diploid
this
number.
seed.
Meiosis is the
Okay.
process that is
So
the
we
two
have our
stages
seed,
that it goes through.
and we have our seed
Is
coat.
this portion of the
and
life
we
cycle
have everything that
bears the
goes
flower.
along
So it's
with
through that
it.
process of meiosis that the plant actually bears
Sorry
flowers.
for the disruption, my
Flowering
don't help
produces
out
two types of
sometimes.
spores.
All right.
Either microspores.
So where were
or
we? We have a
megaspores.
seed.
Pretty obvious.
So we
what
have the
those two mean.
seed of our
Microspores are very,
plant
very
here.
small. The megaspores are
And
the
we
larger
have
ones.
inside
The
the seed,
spores
we have the
actually
seed
divide
coat, we
through a
have our
process of
embryo,
mitosis
we have our
to get the
endosperm,
haploid
all
and
inside the
meophytes.
seed.
So
And what
mitosis
happens
is
then,
that
that
first
seed
stage,
starts to
remember,
develop,
of
and
interphase,
out of
and
that
then,
mitotic process,
prophase, metaphase, anaphase,
we end up with
telophase
a
through
flower.
that cytokinesis. We talked about
And that
how
flower
this works in
has
plant cells. If you
full
remember,
reproductive
'cause plant cells are going to
capabilities.
get that cell plate and
The
that cell
anther
wall.
and the ovule are the two that we kind of
gametes,
focus on.
The
The
gametophytes
pollen,
would produce the gametes.
The anther
The
is
gametes used to
created by
produce
this
the
microspore out of the
diploid
pollen
sac.
zygote.
So the zygote
What happens here is the
then going to
ovary
what
or the
is what is then
ovule
going to go
actually
through
creates a
mitosis
megaspore.
to become the diploid.
So then they both
sporophyte, which
individually
becomes a
go
mature
through
organism.
mitosis.
All this
So
is
the
through
microspore
the flowering
goes through mitosis,
process.
and the megaspore goes through mitosis.
So whenever we look at it, here is
and this is that splitting process that they're going through. The microspores
start here
develop
at number
into the
one.
male
We have the
gametophytes or
sporophyte.
pollen
We have
grains.
a full-fledged
The
flower.
megaspores
And
develop
we
into
have
the
the
embryo
anther,
sac or the female
and
gametophytes.
then we have the
So
ovary.
then what we have
the
happen
ovule
is these two
And
go
so what
through
we have is
this entire
reproduction that's going
process,
to take place right here.
and we
From the
have
anther over into
all the different
ovary,
parts through here, the
and
tube
then
cell,
we're going to
generative
get
cell,
the
pollen
meiosis to
grain
take place.
of the pollen grain.
So
And
as we
have
get that
then
meiosis to
the
take place,
polar
here's what's
nuclei,
happening.
the egg
we have a
cell,
microspore
and everything in the embryo
coming from the
sac on
anther,
this side.
and we have a megaspore.
So what we then
coming
have happen
from
is this is
the
our
ovule.
pollen
So
tube
if you want to
that
think of
we
them as
see
the
right
sperm
here.
and the
These,
egg,
the
if that's
ovary
easier for
is
you to
where the
think
egg
about,
is
but
being
really what
formed
it is
here.
is
And
the pollen
in
grain,
the anther,
is
or
the
in these
microspore
pollen
coming from
sacs.
the male side.
Up here is where the
and
process
the
of
female
the male
gametophyte
gametophyte is the
where
embryo
pollen is
sac,
being
which is
created.
the megaspore coming
So
from
then
the
what
other
has to
side.
happen
Is
So
the pollen
what
that
happens
is
then
created
is they do
comes
become
up
the
and
sperm
enters
and the
in
egg.
the pollen tube.
And as they do so, they
and the
fertilize,
pollen tube
and
is
as
right
they
here in the
fertilize,
process. So you can see
they
it
become
enters
a
into the
zygote.
pollen tube. And notice
And
some
that
things here.
zygote
Notice
then
how
becomes a
the
seed.
anther
And
is
that
actually
seed goes through
taller than the
mitosis
pollen tube. That is
and
by
develops
design,
into a
so that plants
sporophyte.
can self-pollinate.
So that's kind of the process.
So it enters
kinda
then,
quick,
the sperm will come
running
down
around
through
there.
the
So we
pollen
have
tube,
the sporophyte, we have a flower.
and it is now
And
a
that flower
mature male
produces-
gametophyte
goes
into
through
the tube,
through
and it
the
will enter
meiosis
down
process
through the tube
first,
into the egg,
which is the
and
reproductive
we will
process.
get
Then
a
it goes through the
fertilization that
mitosis
takes
process,
place.
which is the splitting.
Once it is fertilized,
it
it
to
now
produce.
develops
So it's
a
a little bit
fully
maybe different than
functional
what you thought
seed
before, but just kind of pay attention to
containing
this so that
an
you know
embryonic
the stages
sporophyte
here.
and an endosperm.
Then
So this is just a
we're going to
cycle
kind
that
of take
continues to occur. We have this seed here. So let's
Okay.
look at
We're
pollination.
going to go
and some of the
through
things
what
that
has to
happen. So the
happen
pollen
for
grain
this
contains
seed.
the male gamete.
Okay.
So we have our
So,
seed. During pollination,
and we
this is
have
the
our
transfer
seed
of
coat,
pollen from the
and
anther
we
to
have
the stigma.
everything that goes
So
along
from the
with
anther
it.
to the stigma. Okay. This is an example
Sorry for
of
the disruption,
cross-pollination
my coworkers.
that takes place. So
Don't help out
cross-pollination
sometimes.
is when
All right.
the pollen
So where were
travels
we?
from
We have
one
a seed.
flower to another.
So we have the seed of
This
our
is
plant
desirable
here.
because it keeps up the genetic
And we
diversity
have
and
the
promotes variation
inside the
plants.
seed, we have the seed
So we
coat,
have our embryo,
the
we have our
pollination
endosperm
that's occurring
all inside
from
the seed.
pollen
And what
another
happens then,
stigma
that
on a
seed
different
starts to
plant.
develop.
Okay.
It
And
could occur,
out
this
of
would be
that
self-pollination if it
mitotic
occurred here.
process,
But notice
we end up with
how
a
the
flower.
stigma on this plant is closed.
And that flower
so it
is
cannot
has full reproductive
so it cannot
capabilities.
accept. It has to move to
The
another plant
anther
for that.
and the ovule are the two that we kind of focus on.
So pollen can be carried by
the
between
anther
flowers by insects or by wind,
created by this
sometimes
microspore
it
out
is
of the pollen
done
sac.
by us.
What happens
in
here is
pollination
the
experiments as
ovary
well.
or the ovule
But insect-pollinated
creates a
flowers are adapted to
megaspore.
attract the insects.
So
to
then
them.
they both individually
And this
go
enables the
through
transfer
mitosis.
of pollen.
So
as
the
pollen has
microspore
barbs and hooks
goes
onto
through
the insect
mitosis,
first.
and the megaspore
So you can see
goes through mitosis. And this is that
the
splitting process
pollen looks
that
right
they're
here,
going
kind
through.
of
The
spikes that
microspores
attaches
develop
onto
into
the
the male
legs of the
gametophytes or
insects or whatever,
grains.
but also
The
flowers
megaspores develop
in this
into the
case, the
embryo
pollen
sac
is
or
actually
the female
brighter
gametophytes.
colored.
So then what we
may
may
see
see is that the
these
anthers
two
are
go
actually
through
bright colored
this
inside
entire
some of the
process,
plants, if we can find
some to look at. Also,
and we have
the brightly colored petals are
all
there
of the
to
different parts
attract
through here, the tube
insects.
cell, generative
The
cell,
sticky
pollen
stigma
grain
then
of the pollen grain. And
will
we have
collect the
then
pollen a little bit later.
the
You can
polar
see that in the
nuclei,
middle.
the
We'll
egg
look at
cell,
that. So what
and
happens
everything in the embryo
is
sac
the
on this side.
stigma here is kind
So
of
what we
sticky.
then have
So it
happen
was
is
attached
this
to the
is our
insect. The
pollen
insect
tube
may rub it
that
off
we see
onto
right
the
here.
stigma where
These,
it gets
the
collected so that it can
ovary
fertilize.
is where the egg is being formed here.
Wind-pollinated flowers are a
in
little bit different.
the
Their
anther
structure
or in these pollen
is
sacs
something different. They don't
here
have
is
the
where the
attractant of
process
insects, but
of
they
the
need to be
male
exposed to the
gametophyte or
wind.
the pollen
So
being
notice the
created.
petals are often small.
So then what has to
on
happen
some of these
is
that are
the
carried by
pollen
wind.
that is
Pollen grains are
created
going to be very
comes up
small
and
very
enters
light,
in
and they're going
the
to be
pollen
in much
tube.
larger numbers.
And the pollen tube
Notice
is
here that
right
the
here in the
anther is
process,
up
so you
and
can see it enters
exposed
into the
to the
pollen
wind.
tube. And
The
notice some
stigma
things here.
tend
Notice
to
how
be
the
kind of feathery,
anther
kind of wispy
is
here, almost
actually
looks like a
taller
Velcro-like
than the
structure.
pollen tube. That is by
That's
design, so that
when
when the
plants can
wind
self-pollinate.
blows the pollen,
So
it
can
enters.
attract
Then
it.
the sperm will come
And
down
again,
through
there's
the
no
pollen
scent
tube,
or nectary or anything.
and
with
it is
these,
now a mature
with some
male
of these pollen
gametophyte
grains and things
into
like
the
this,
tube,
notice the
and it
petals
will
are
enter
small,
down through the tube
because they don't have
into
to
the
attract the
egg,
insects, 'cause
and
the
we
wind
will
is doing
get
the
a
work here.
fertilization that takes place.
Self-pollination
Once it is fertilized,
occurs when
it
the
now
pollen falls
develops
from
a
the anther
fully functional seed
onto the stigma of the same flower.
containing
Self-pollination
an embryonic
does
sporophyte
not
and an
promote
embryo.
variation, so it is not as
So this is just a
desirable.
cycle that continues to occur.
So you can see.
So let's look at
here's how it
pollination and
goes,
some of the
it
things
has to
that
be
happen.
carried
So
up
the
and
pollen
in. A lot
grain
of times
contains
this is
the
in an
male
enclosed
gamete.
environment.
So
with
during
the petals
pollination,
kind
this is
of
the transfer of
forming
pollen
around
from the
plant.
anther to the stigma.
So
flowers
from the
sometimes
anther
will prevent
to
self-pollination
the stigma,
by either
This
having
is
the
an example
stigma
of
above the stamen, so you
cross-pollination
can see
that
here the
takes
stigma
place.
is
So quite a ways above the
cross-pollination
stamen
is when
or
the pollen travels from one
the
flower
stigma and
to
stamen
another.
mature at different
Okay?
times.
This
So
is
here,
desirable because
we
it
can
keeps up
see
the genetic diversity and promotes
that
variation.
the
among
stigma
plants.
is not
So
mature
we have
where it is over
the
here.
pollination
So
that's
once
occurring
the stigma
from
matures,
the pollen
the
to
stamen
another stigma
are
on a
then
different plant.
no longer viable.
Okay. It
So
could
when you
occur.
have a
This would be
viable
self-pollination
stamen,
if it
you
occurred
release
here.
the pollen
But
to come over and
notice
cross-pollinate
how the
into
stigma
a
on this
different
plant is
stigma.
closed. So this
So it
promotes
cannot
cross-pollination.
attack. So it cannot accept. It has to
So
move
we
to
then
another
have
plant for that.
fertilization with fruit development.
So pollen
some
can be carried
plants actually
by
produce
between
fruit,
flowers
and
by
that seed
insects
is
or by
inside
wind.
those fruits.
Sometimes
So let's
it is
look at
done
how this
by
happens.
us.
So once
in
pollination
experiments
occurs,
as well.
a tube grows from the
Insect-pollinated
pollen,
flowers are adapted to attract the insects
and
to
the
them.
grain will go down through the
And this
style
enables the
into
transfer
ovule of pollen.
As
And
pollen
notice
has
here the
barbs and
petals
hooks onto the insect furs
are just
so
not
you can
shown.
see
There might be petals
the-
in here and more than just
the-
what we
the
have here for the sepal.
pollen
There would be
looks
petals
right
on there.
here. It kind of has spikes
All right,
that
so
attaches
this is
onto
through
the legs
then
of the
stigma
insects or
and
whatever,
style,
but
the
also the
carpel,
flowers
female
or
reproductive part.
in this case
So
the
the
pollen
pollen
goes
goes
in,
in,
brighter color,
travels down through
so
as you
that
see it
you
going
may
down
see
through
that the
around
anthers are
and
actually bright colored
into one
inside
of
some of the
ovules.
plants if we can find some to look at.
Right.
Also,
The fertilization
brightly colored
occurs when the
petals are
male
there to
gamete
attract
fuses
the
with the
insects.
ovule.
the
right
sticky
here.
stigma then.
So once they fuse,
will
that's when
collect the
fertilization
pollen a little bit
occurs.
later. You can see that
So
in
now
the
you
middle.
can
We'll
see
look at that. So
the
what
fertilization
happens
is going to
is
occur.
the stigma here is
Right?
kind of sticky.
Some plants
so it
have
was
the
attached to the
ability for
insect. The
seed
insect may
dispersal.
rub it off.
So we can see here
onto the
lovely
stigma
dreaded
where it gets
dandelion.
collected so that it can
This is
fertilize.
what happens after they go
Wind
through the
pollinated
process.
flowers
and
are
we
a
have
little
the
bit
seeds
different.
left
Their
there.
structure
These will be
is
distributed
something
by the
different.
wind.
They don't have
and
the
as they get
attractant of
distributed, you will
insects,
have
but they
that
need to be
process
exposed
going
to the
through
wind.
meiosis
So
and
notice the
mitosis
petals are
again.
often
often small.
So let's talk about
on
after
some of these that are
fertilization
carried by
what
wind.
happens.
Pollen
After
grains are going to be
fertilization,
very
the
small
petals,
and very
the
light,
stamen, and the sepals
they're
all
going to
fall
be
off.
in much larger
The ovule
numbers.
turns into a seed.
Notice
at
here
that
that the
point.
anther is
The
up and
fertilized egg
exposed
inside
to the
develops
wind.
into an embryo
The
plant.
stigma tend to be
this is something
kind
that
of
you
feathery,
will be
kind of
asked
wispy
to
here, almost
identify
looks
on
like a
the exam, I'm
Velcro-like
telling you
structure.
now. That's
so
notice
that
the testa
when the
is the
wind
seed
and it
coat.
blows the pollen,
micropyle is a hole that was made
and
by
again,
the
there's
pollen
no
tube.
scent or
Remember when
nectar
we
or
showed it
anything
coming
with
down
these,
to the plant and making
with
the
some
hole?
of these pollen
Then
grains and things like this.
we
and
showed
the petals are
the
small,
the pollen traveling
because
down
they
in
don't
here.
have to
So
attract the insects because the
the
wind
cotyledon
is
is a
doing the work here.
food storage mechanism inside here.
Self-pollination
The plumule
occurs
is the
when
embryo
the pollen
shoot,
falls from the
and the
anther
radicle is the actual
onto the
embryo
stigma of the same
root.
flower.
So this
Self-pollination
will
does
come
not
out through
promote
here.
variation, so it is
This
not
will be
as
the root.
desirable.
This will come out, and this will be the shoot.
So you can
of the
see
plant, or the
here's how
stem
it
that
goes, and
above
it
there.
has to be carried up and in. A lot of times
Right,
this is
so
in an enclosed
water leaves the
environment,
seed,
and it
with the
dehydrates. It
petals
becomes
kind of
dormant because the metabolic
forming
reaction
around the
stopped the ovary.
So
and it
flowers
develops and
sometimes will
becomes a
prevent
fruit. So here we see the
self-pollination
fruit by either having
the
the
fleshy
stigma
wall
above
of
the
the
stamen,
ovary.
so you can
Yes,
see
you're
the
eating
stigma
an
is quite a ways
adapted ovary when you
above the
crunch into an
stamen,
apple.
or
This
is the
the
adapted
stigma
ovary
and stamen
of the
mature
fruit.
at
It
different
just
times.
grew
So
out of
here
the seed
we
is
can
what's
see
actually
that
dehydrated
the stigma is
inside
not
there.
matured where it is over
Water
here.
leaves the seed and
So
goes out
once
then.
the stigma
So
matures,
seeds need to be
the
dispersed
stamen are
away from the
then
parent
no
material.
longer
So this can
viable.
be done
So when you have a
by
viable
wind,
stamen,
water,
you release the
mechanical
pollen
elements,
to come over and
animals.
cross-pollinate into a different
example here,
stigma.
blackberries. Birds eat the blackberries.
So this
and then
promotes
they distribute
cross-pollination
through flying over and
So we
droppings.
then have fertilization.
We
we
have
have some
fruit
here.
development.
These are the wonderful
So
whirly
some
birds that you
plants
see every
actually
spring
produce
in your
fruit,
gutters,
and that seed is inside
and
those
wind
fruits.
will distribute
So
them.
let's look at how this happens.
So now let's
So
look
once
at the
pollination
germination process
occurs,
and what
a
takes
tube
place.
grows
The
from
seed
the
contains
pollen,
an embryo plant and
cotyledons,
and
or
the
starch
grain will go
stores.
down through the style
All right,
into the
so
ovule.
water enters through
And
the
notice here the
micropyle and
petals
activates enzymes inside.
are just not shown.
The water
There
also
might be
softens
petals
the
in
testa
here
and
and
more
outside
than just what
here
we
that
have
allows
here
it
for
to
the
split.
split. There would be petals on
So
there.
now what we're having
All
is
right,
we
so
activated
this is
the
through
enzyme,
then
we get
the stigma
our
and the style, or
root
the
that's going to be
carpel,
activated,
the
and
female
our
reproductive
plumule
that's
part.
going to get activated.
So the
here.
pollen goes in.
So then
travels
what happens
down through
is
as you
the
see it
plumule
going
is going
down
to head
through,
up, enzymes
around,
down
and
the starches
into one of the
into
ovules.
sugars, and the
Right?
glucose is
The
used
fertilization
for respiration.
occurs
It
when the
provides
male
energy
gamete
because we can't
fuses
perform
with the
photosynthesis
ovule
yet. We're not
right
above
here.
the ground.
So once
The
they
radical
fuse, that's when
grows to
fertilization
absorb more
occurs.
water.
So
Okay?
now you can
So this
see
is what happens. This
the
is going to go
fertilization
above the
is going
ground.
to occur.
This is going to stay in the ground and absorb
Right?
water. It still
Some
has
plants
starch
have
stores in
the
here
ability for
to
seed
enable
dispersal.
it to continue.
So we can see here the lovely
to
driven
have the
dandelion.
energy it needs.
This is what happens.
So amylase
after
is
it
going
goes
to
through
get
the process,
secreted
and we
in
have the
this
seeds
process,
left there.
and that's going
These
to
will be
activate.
distributed
That's
by
an
the
enzyme that's
wind,
going to
and
activate
as they get
more
distributed,
growth.
you will have that process going
All right,
through.
the starch gets created
and
and
then
mitosis
turned
again.
into a sugar.
So let's talk about after
and it gets
fertilization,
absorbed.
what happens.
After
And the seed is
fertilization, the
germinated
petals,
now.
the
So
stamen,
this is what
and the
starts to
sepals all
happen.
fall off.
Germination
The ovule
takes place,
turns
and this
into
is
a
going to
seed
typically
at that
happen as it
point.
warms
The
up, or
fertilized
the
egg
conditions
inside
become
develops
correct.
into an embryo
You can see the
plant.
root comes out
So,
first.
This
The
is something
plumule
that
starts
you
to
will
come
be
up.
asked to
The
identify.
roots continue
on
to
the
develop.
exam.
The
I'm telling
plumule
you
continues
now.
to develop.
So
And
notice the
it
testa
then
is the
will
seed
come up
coat.
here and start
The
to
micropyle is a hole that was
photosynthesize
made
its
by the
own
pollen
food
tube.
at this
Remember
point.
when we showed
And
it
now
coming
all
down
that
to
the
the
plant
root
and making
system
the
will
whole
do
is take up
then
and
we
take
showed
water. Notice the seed is
the
pretty
pollen
much
traveling
dried
down
up
and
at
in.
this
So,
point because it's used all
the
nutrients,
cotyledon
the
is a
starches
food
that were
storage
stored there,
mechanism inside here.
and it's going to
The
now
plumule
need
is the embryo
photosynthesis
shoot,
in order to
and
get
the radicle is the actual
sugars that it needs to
embryo
grow to
root.
create the glucose.
So this will
So,
come out
when
through
we look
here.
at the dry
This will be
mass
the
of the
root.
seed,
This will come
notice
out, and
that
this will be
we
the
have quite a
shoot
bit of
the
dry
plant or the
mass
stem
in
that
here.
goes above the ground.
Then that moisture starts to
All
get
right,
used.
so water
So the
leaves
solid
seed,
matter and
it
with all the
dehydrates.
water
It
will
becomes
start to get
dormant because the
removed.
metabolic
Seed
reactions
loses
stop
weight, if you
the
will, here
ovary, and it
as it
develops
uses
and
up the
becomes a
starch
fruit. So
stores.
here
and the
we see the
cotyledons,
fruit.
They can't
The
photosynthesize
fleshy
yet, but
wall
using
of
up
the
all of its
ovary.
nutrients
Yes, you're eating
inside.
an adapted ovary.
Then,
and crunch into
as
an
the
apple.
photosynthesis
This
begins,
is the
the
adapted
plant will start to
ovary
grow,
of the
and
fruit. It
its
just grew out
essentially
of it. The
carbon
seed is what's
content
actually
back in here, its sugars and things
dehydrated
will increase
inside
again
there.
as the plant grows.
Water leaves the seed and goes out.
That's
to
all
that.
we have for today.
All right, so
I
seeds
look
need to be
forward
dispersed
seeing you this
away
evening.
from the parent material. So this can be done by wind, water,
mechanical elements, or animals. So, example here, blackberries. Birds eat the blackberries, and then they distribute the seeds through flying over and droppings. We have some here. These are the wonderful whirly birds that you see every spring in your gutters, and wind will distribute them. So now let's look at the germination process and what takes place. The seed contains an embryo plant and cotyledons, or starch stores. All right, so water enters through the micropyle and activates enzymes inside. The water also softens the testa, or this outside here, that allows it to split. So now what we're having is we activated the enzyme, we get our root that's going to be activated and our plumule that's going to get activated here. So then what happens is the plumule is going to head up. Enzymes are going to break down the starches into sugars, and the glucose is used for respiration. It provides it energy because we can't perform photosynthesis yet. We're not above the ground. The radical grows to absorb more water. Okay, so this is what happens. This is going to go above the ground. This is going to stay in the ground and absorb water. It still has starch stores in here to enable it to continue to have the energy it needs. So amylase is going to get secreted in this process, and that's going to activate. That's an enzyme that's going to activate more growth. All right, the starch gets created and turned into a sugar, and it gets absorbed, and the seed is germinated now. So this is what starts to happen. Germination takes place, and this is going to typically happen as it warms up or the conditions become correct. You can see the root comes out first, the plumule starts to come up, the roots continue to develop, the plumule continues to develop, and it then will come up here and start to photosynthesize its own food at this point. And now all that the root system will do is take in water. Notice the seed is pretty much dried up at this point because it's used all the nutrients, the starches that were stored there, and it's going to now need photosynthesis in order to get the sugars that it needs to grow to create the glucose. So when we look at the dry mass of the seed, notice that we have quite a bit of dry mass in here. Then that moisture starts to get used. So the solid matter and with all the water will start to get removed. Seed loses weight, if you will, here as it uses up the starch stores and the cotyledons. They can't photosynthesize yet, but it's using up all of its nutrients inside. Then, as the photosynthesis begins, the plant will start to grow, and its essentially carbon content back in here, its sugars and things, will increase again as the plant grows. That's all we have for today. I look forward to seeing you this evening.